US intelligence says Russia's army is collapsing. Not stalling, not struggling, collapsing. After months of grinding assaults, soaring casualties, and drones filling the skies, Putin's forces are now bleeding manpower, armor, and momentum faster than they can replace them, and Western analysts say the breaking point is near. Massive tank losses, exhausted artillery, 1 million casualties. And the kicker, even with record recruitment, Russia can't launch another major offensive. What we're witnessing isn't just a tactical setback, it's a turning point. So what exactly did US intel uncover, and how close is Russia to total collapse? Let's break it down, starting with territory. This is all according to Richard Barrons, who is the former head of the UK's Joint Forces Command. He's clear about where Russia's main problem lies. Russia is very gradually taking bits of territory still, but at an unsustainably high cost. Barron's point is backed by an anonymous Ukrainian security official who explained to the Kyiv Independent the problem that Putin now faces. Russia is not able to take any ground, and this is the situation pretty much since the end of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The official is referring to what many saw as Ukraine's supposedly failed counteroffensive in 2023. Though that attempt to push Russia out of Ukraine's territory ultimately didn't work, it appears to have at least helped Ukraine take out enough Russian soldiers and equipment to allow Ukraine to reinforce its defenses to the point where Putin's numbers advantage is becoming less and less relevant. Despite the fact that they still have a 3-to-1 superiority in numbers of troops, and maybe even bigger in terms of weapon systems, it's still not enough, says the official, and the numbers seem to back this up. According to the UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD, Russia managed to capture around 130 square miles of Ukraine in April. That comes off the back of several months where Russia saw its capture rate decline markedly, culminating in March 2025, when Putin's forces captured only 55 square miles. So we saw a slight improvement in April, with Russia managing to take about 2.3 square miles of Ukraine per day. Much of that territory was taken around Pokrovsk, where the Russian army has instituted a new push in Putin's effort to take the Donbas region. However, that alone reveals how Putin's territorial ambitions are failing. Russia's leader has been trying to take Pokrovsk since at least 2024, mainly because it's Ukraine's main logistical hub in the region, and partially because taking Pokrovsk leaves Russia's leader closer to the Donetsk administrative border. However, every effort Russia makes is failing, and the country is losing huge numbers of troops in the process. We don't have the full Russian troop casualties figures for April yet. However, several reports of daily losses show just how extensive Russia's casualties were during the month. For instance, April 23rd saw Russia lose 1,210 of its soldiers, along with 85 of its artillery systems, in just 24 hours. The following day, Russia lost 1,060 soldiers, along with 3 of its tanks, to Ukraine's defenses. If we take these 2 days to give us an average for April, we can safely assume that Putin is sacrificing around 1,135 of his soldiers every 24 hours to make his meager gains in Ukraine. That amounts to 1,100 soldiers lost per 2.3 square miles of territory taken in April. Barrons and the unnamed Ukrainian official are right. These aren't sustainable losses for Russia's military. And it's a similar point that's made by a recent US Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, assessment that suggests Russia is still just about winning, but at a massive cost. Presented to Congress by Lieutenant General Jeffrey A. Cruz, according to the Washington Post, the report claims that the Ukraine war probably will continue to slowly trend in Russia's favor through 2025, absent either negotiated settlement or more robust Western assistance. However, agreeing with Barrons, the report says that the pace of Russia's gains in Ukraine are slowing and continue to come at the expense of high personnel and equipment losses. The DIA assessment digs deeper. The numbers revealed to Congress showcase just how bad things are getting for Putin. According to the report, Russia has lost at least 10,000 ground combat vehicles, including more than 3,000 tanks, as well as nearly 250 aircraft and helicopters, and more than 10 naval vessels. Those figures may even be conservative. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that they're even higher across the board. Ukraine says that Russia has actually lost 10,854 tanks, 22,622 armored fighting vehicles, 372 aircraft, 336 helicopters, 28 ships, and a submarine. Whichever way you slice it, these losses are bad. Really bad. The Washington Post says that both current and former Western officials have also highlighted just how much of a meat grinder Putin's war has devolved into. During the past 12 months, Russia has succeeded in taking only 0.6% of Ukraine's territory, at the cost of 1,500 soldiers killed or wounded per day, the officials claim. In some quarters, it's believed that Russia's losses now amount to 1 million soldiers, with Ukraine's Ministry of Finance saying the number is currently 980,850. According to the Washington Post, this situation has gotten so bad for Putin that he's had to change the way he's approaching his invasion. It says that neither side has managed to make any significant advances on the ground, meaning the war has altered to the point where both Russia and Ukraine are relying on long-range missile and drone strikes to cause damage. That's not a surprise for Ukraine. It was never trying to take over Russia in the first place. But for Russia, the increasing reliance on these sort of attacks showcases how Putin can no longer rely on his troops on the ground to take territory. The numbers showcase this increasing reliance on a long-range strategy. On May 23rd, Russia pelted Ukraine with 298 attack drones and 69 ballistic missiles, says Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Ukraine responded by sending waves of its own drones into Russia the following weekend, leading to Russian officials claiming their country's air defenses shot down around 700 drones during a 72-hour period, around 100 of which were approaching Moscow. Putin's approach has changed because he's been forced to switch from focusing on taking territory to simply prolonging the war to hold off Russia's collapse. With every such strike, the world sees more clearly that it is Moscow that's prolonging the war, Zelensky claimed, following the May 23rd strike. It's clear now that much more pressure must be applied on Russia for any real diplomacy to begin, Zelensky added. Only additional sanctions targeting key sectors of the Russian economy will force Moscow to stop the attacks. We'll get to the idea of more sanctions and the Western response to Russia's faltering attempts to take Ukraine later, but the Washington Post makes a key point. Drones and long-range strikes do not conquer territory and will not win the war for either side, it says various officials and experts have told the outlet. Therein lies Putin's problem. Drones have become the dominant killer in the Ukraine war, accounting for 80% of battlefield casualties on both sides, claim Western officials. However, drones aren't capable of taking territory, which is what Putin ultimately needs to do if he's going to win the war he started. They can kill, they can cause damage, but they're not capable of occupying. The drones need to be followed up with soldiers on the ground, and as multiple experts have pointed out, Putin isn't able to do that because of a combination of Ukraine's defenses and Russia's weakening military. But why? Jack Watling, who's a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, believes he has the answer. Speaking on behalf of the London-based organization, Watling points out that Russia has managed to draw a record number of recruits to its military in 2025. That would suggest that Putin's forces on the ground are only going to grow stronger. They're not. Watling points out that those recruits have been enticed into Russia's military by a combination of the promise of massive cash payouts and an assurance from Russia that the war will come to an end soon. The result is that Russia's military is increasingly relying on poorly trained, fresh faces who aren't capable of making the territorial gains that Putin needs. Watling notes that this may be the reason why Russia's ground advances have slowed to a crawl. However, he also adds that Ukraine's defenses partially account for Russia's ongoing failures. In particular, the RUSI fellow says, Ukraine has created a 10-mile defensive zone that's absolutely filled to the brim with trenches and mines. Ukraine has set up this zone around the territory that Putin wants to capture. Its strategy is simple: push Russia's forces into this kill zone to slow them down. Mines do a lot of the work in taking out Russia's mechanized forces, with Ukraine backing those defenses with short-range drones that decimate any Russian forces who even come close to Ukraine's front line. Putin is being forced to rely on his long-range approaches as a result. He has to. His troops on the ground simply can't achieve what he wants to achieve. The Washington Post also quotes a Ukrainian official as saying that Ukraine's 2024 Kursk incursion likely has a role to play in Russia's failing attempts to take territory. In August 2024, Ukraine sent a small force of its soldiers into the Russian oblast of Kursk, taking advantage of Putin's weak border defenses in the process. Ukraine managed to capture around 1,250 square miles of Russian territory, including 92 settlements, in just a couple of weeks. What followed was a months-long attempt by Russia to expel Ukraine from Kursk. Russia succeeded, but at a massive cost. By the time Russia was claiming to have expelled Ukraine from Kursk, it had lost a staggering 62,000 soldiers, says Reuters. Ukraine's losses were no less substantial, at least if you believe Russia's defense ministry. It says Ukraine lost 76,000 soldiers and 412 tanks in the battle for Kursk, though it seems likely those numbers were inflated to make Ukraine's casualty rate seem worse than Russia's. The Ukrainian security official says that this was all part of the plan. Ukraine's Kursk invasion forced Putin to divert resources to retake a slither of Russia's own land, the official claims. That led to pressure being relieved in the Donbass, affording Ukraine the time to set up the defenses that are now forcing Putin to churn over 1,000 of his soldiers per day to make tiny advances. Russia can't keep this up. Even with huge numbers of recruits entering its military in 2025, Putin has found himself in a stalemated position. And it makes sense. The new recruits aren't battle-hardened before they're sent to the front lines. They're just bodies Putin is sending to the slaughter, incapable of taking the land he needs. And it gets worse for Russia's leader, much worse. Beyond the rampant people problems, Putin is also dealing with the fact that he's simply running out of tanks. RUSI's Jack Watling points this out, stating, "The Russians can continue fighting. The force will become more and more demechanized over time, and that does put a timeline on how long they can sustain the current way they operate." Watling isn't wrong. We shared the sheer scale of Russia's tank losses already. As early as February, intelligence reports were pointing out that these losses were unsustainable. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, Russia lost 1,400 of its main battle tanks, along with experiencing high losses of its armored fighting vehicles. Again, the IISS figures are conservative and only account for confirmed battlefield losses. Still, even with those conservative figures, the IISS says that Russia is struggling. It has more tanks and vehicles in storage, the group says. The problem Putin faces is that most of this equipment is in a terrible state of disrepair. Putin has already pulled the tanks and vehicles from his Soviet stockpiles that could be easily refurbished, leaving him with the dregs. And even if Russia can restore more of this aging stockpile, the IISS points out that its massive equipment losses can't be offset by the refurbishment process. The result, according to the IISS, is simple. Russia will not have enough main battle tanks to continue its operations beyond 2026. Putin's situation isn't helped by the fact that Russia's defense industry is only capable of producing around 200 new battle tanks annually. Normally, that would be an impressive number. But when your country is churning through 7 times that many per year, assuming a conservative estimate, that production, combined with the attempted refurbishment of constantly diminishing tank stockpiles, only spells bad news for an offensive that already seems to be stalemated on the ground. It all adds up to one terrible piece of news for Putin. Russia is running out of offensive opportunities. Barron's points out that Russia is on the verge of going past the peak in terms of its ability to take Ukrainian territory. Russia is actually culminating in its ability to conduct an offensive, Barron tells the Washington Post. It's very unlikely now that the Russian military has the equipment, the people, and the training and logistics to mount an offensive that would break the Ukrainian line and, even if they did, exploit it immediately. Barron's is backed up by another Western expert, Dara Masakot of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. There's a difference between pushing the Ukrainians back 5 to 10 kilometers at a time at high cost versus having the assembled manpower and armor behind that to exploit a breakthrough and to occupy and push through all of those obstacles, Masakot tells the Washington Post. That's still a really large bill in terms of equipment that they need, and I just don't see that concentration anywhere. In short, Russia can't achieve Putin's goals. Those goals have shifted throughout Russia's invasion. At the start, Putin wanted to take the entire country. That was the point of his flash offensive back in February 2022. It was meant to be a few days campaign during which Ukraine's defenses would crumble in the face of Russia's might. When that didn't work out, Putin adapted to the war of attrition we still see today, believing he could take all of Ukraine through sheer numbers. That didn't work either. Now the goal seems to be taking key Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. What we see here is a consistent reduction of what Putin wants to achieve in Ukraine, forced by the fact that Ukraine isn't rolling over for Russia. Now, if Masakot and the many other experts quoted in this video are to be believed, Russia isn't even capable of launching the concerted ground offensives needed to take those full regions. It's going to pretend that it can. Russia is preparing a vast summer offensive to give the impression that its military is still operating at full strength. However, we'll see the evidence that it isn't with Putin's increasing reliance on long-range assaults, Russia's lack of mechanized units, and the massive sacrifices of soldiers in exchanges for scraps of territory that we're already seeing. Compounding all of these issues for Putin is that he likely isn't receiving accurate information. Putin believes that time is on his side and Ukraine is bleeding faster than Russia, one European official told the Washington Post. However, that isn't the case, and another European official says that Putin may be getting misled by subordinates who are just telling Russia's leader what he wants to hear rather than reflecting the true state of the Ukrainian battlefield in their reports. "I think they overestimate the current success of Russia," the official says of these subordinates. So Putin is operating on false information, both in terms of the level of success his forces are achieving, Ukraine, and the strength of Russia's military. All of this leads us to a question: what happens next? According to the DIA's report, suffering under these delusions means that Russia isn't going to change its strategy. The report claims that Putin seems comfortable with the current cost of its slow advances, calculating they can steadily drain Ukraine's resources and will, and outlast the West's support for Ukraine. The suggestion seems to be that it's time for the West to help Ukraine take advantage of Russia's growing weakness. We mentioned this earlier when discussing Zelensky's calls for more Western sanctions to be placed against Russia. Ukraine's leader believes that these sanctions would damage Russia at a time when it's planning to spend $150 billion on defense in 2025. That's a 25% increase when adjusted for inflation on Russia's 2024 budget and accounts for about 40% of Russia's total federal budget. Sanctions would ramp up the pressure, and there's a bipartisan proposal in the US right now to do just that. On May 21st, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal introduced legislation with the support of 81 other senators that outright questioned the value of ceasefire talks at a time when Russia is both weakened and demonstrating that it's not going to stop fighting. That legislation calls for the implementation of secondary sanctions on any country that does business with Russia in the key fields of oil, gas, uranium, and similar products. Specifically, it calls for the US to institute a 500% tariff on any nation that buys these products from Russia, with the goal being to push those nations out of Putin's clutches. Fewer purchases of Russian supplies means less cash flowing into Putin's coffers, a situation Russia's leader doesn't need when he's already draining Russia's financial reserves to fund his war. The issue is that the US may not follow through on these sanctions. On May 16th, US President Donald Trump suggested that there's a possibility that the US will walk away from ceasefire negotiations entirely following long phone calls with both Putin and Zelensky. Trump claimed that he had a red line in his head that would cause him to walk away. "I do have a certain line, but I don't want to say what that line is because it makes the negotiation even more difficult." Whether the crossing of this line would simply mean an end to ceasefire talks or the withdrawal of US support from Ukraine is yet to be seen. Zelensky will hope that it's the former, as all signs point to Ukraine being able to win against a crumbling Russian military, given the myriad problems US and other Western experts are pointing out. And Zelensky may just be in luck. If Trump seemed to be softening on Putin 10 days ago, he's now less than happy with Russia's leader. Speaking after Russia's May 25th airstrike that involved 367 missiles and drones and killed 12 people, Trump said, "What the hell happened to him? He's killing a lot of people." Trump also branded Putin as absolutely crazy for the attacks, while warning Russia's leader that his continued attempts to conquer Ukraine will lead to Russia's downfall. Trump seems to be on the verge of hardening on Putin, especially if Russia's leader moves deeper into his summer offensive. That's a problem for Putin. He was relying on what he saw as his ability to play the US to prolong the war. If he ever had that ability, it's slipping through his fingers, especially now that the US is aware of just how weak Russia's military is. But what do you think about the crumbling of Russia's military and the true shift it's bringing to the Ukraine war? Are we seeing the start of a turning point where Russia's ground offensives go from barely effective to practically non-existent in terms of territory gained? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war. Now go and check out You Won't Believe These Numbers. Russia will not recover for 100 years. Or click this other video instead.